and cervical cancer is the 4th most common cancer in women worldwide. This was in Scally's report when he published his report in September 18. And he went on to say, in Ireland in 2015, the most recent year for which data was published, there were 241 cases of cervical cancer. And he goes on to talk about the importance of screening and an effective screening service, and we all know that. And I heard Deputy Breach Smith speak earlier on about being patronised in terms of screening. We know as a woman how important screening is. That's not what this was about. And I remember being on the public accounts before I go into the body of what I'm going to say, and what truly horrified me were the internal memos which we eventually elicited that were more worried about publication and screaming headlines than the actual failures that had taken place. And that stays with me. Indeed, I won't personalise it, but the medical people from the Department of Health utterly failed to see the relevance of that for women. And indeed, Dr. Scally didn't put much emphasis on it either in his very, very welcome and methodical report. But certainly he failed to see that the memos were more concerned about avoiding screaming headlines than actually dealing with the issue. So we're here today now to extend the time, and none of us could disagree with that. However, what are we extending? We're extending a piece of legislation that allows for women affected by this scandal to come forward and go to a tribunal. And yet we know that nobody has come forward. We look at the digest. Although the tribunal was established as an alternative to bringing a compensation claim to court, very few claims have been submitted to date. No claims had been made to the tribunal by the 22nd of March 2021. Alarm bells would ring there, wouldn't it, for any government? By March 2021, no claims, but the Minister stated on the 30th of June that 5 claims had been received. By contrast, 199 legal proceedings have issued to date, and so on. Now, I look at why it was brought in, and you have quoted repeatedly the report on an alternative system for dealing with claims arising from CervicalCheck. A very, very succinct report, 32 pages, and it comes down in favour of a tribunal, and that's how the tribunal was set up. But it said many, many other things in that very succinct report, and it talked about the final chapter 13. There is clear urgency that this legislation be passed without delay, and so it was duly passed. But there were many other things that were said about High Court hearings, and the fact that Mr. Justice Kevin Cross, the judge in charge of the personal injuries list, with the cooperation of the solicitors and the barristers, has ensured that these cases have been dealt with in an efficient and timely way, and so on. So there was provision within the existing court system to deal very efficiently with these cases. But we went for a tribunal. I had the most serious reservations about that, and because I think language was being misused in relation to it not being adversarial. And that's not true. Perhaps a little bit less formal than a court setting, but not any less adversarial. And of course, you needed the consent of all parties. And surely if you got the consent of all parties down the court, and surely if liability wasn't an issue, they'd proceed very quickly in the court system. So we went ahead and set up this tribunal, and nobody availed of it. And some women are availing of it now, and I'm glad that they are, in the sense that that's the decision they have made, and obviously for many, many reasons, speed and illness being some of those factors. Within that bill, we were to restore confidence, and nothing has happened. Over 2 years later, you're now telling us in your speech that you're going to set up the process. 2 years afterwards, a facilitator of the meetings has recently been identified, and preparatory work necessary to off. So we're going to restore confidence. We bring in a piece of legislation, and 2 years later, we have absolutely nothing, and we're going to now restore confidence. Forgive me, but my confidence or my trust is at an all-time low. I have one very specific question again before I go back to the general. When I sat on the Public Accounts Committee, we were told by the head of the department that the audit of cervical test results had stopped temporarily. Minister, was that ever reinstated? If not, why not? That should be part of your speech today, because it's an essential. That's how we learned. Well, we didn't actually, but I come to that. But an audit was carried out, and then subsequently those women affected, starting with Vicky Phelan, who was extremely courageous and refused to sign a non-disclosure. Let's remember that now. She refused to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and so for there we learned then what had happened, that an audit had been carried out. We were told repeatedly that was for the purposes of learning, but we didn't learn anything until Vicky Phelan had the courage not to sign the non-disclosure and tell us. And then lots of stuff comes out. And remember the amount of women that have died in the meantime. Out of the total of 208 women whose results might have warranted a different action, 17 have died. 162 women were not told that their smears had been audited and that the audit found that a different action should have been taken. I'm not going to name out the women here, but we're deeply indebted to them and their families for their courage in persisting and bringing this matter to attention. Because if we look at the nature of the speech given to us today, we get a clear indication of the mountain that the women had to climb. Because I would have expected at this point a detailed speech in relation to all of the aspects of the tribunal, of the legislation, the various parts in it that I've mentioned, the audit, and then mandatory disclosure. We have a bill sitting somewhere, I don't know where it's sitting, in relation to disclosure. And remember what Scally said. He had 2 reports, 52 recommendations. And again, in relation to open disclosure. In the Scally report, in courtesy of the digest again, but I have read the full Scally report. In the Scally report, a number of chapters dealt with open disclosure in the context of the Health Executive, the Medical Council, and the CervicalCheck. And he goes on to say, a decision of whether to disclose or not to disclose, leaving that to the unfettered judgment of the clinicians is unacceptable, and that's what happened. And a lack of systematic evaluation of the implementation of the policy. And we go on to the next page, and he says, when disclosure in the substantial majority of the cases eventually happened, this is with the cervical smear cases, it was hurried and took place against a fevered media and political backdrop. The way in which women and families were treated was responsible for substantial hurt and anger. I don't think we needed a report from scoping exercises from Dr. Scally to tell us that, but at least it's down in black and white. And he goes on, a situation where an organisation can be allowed to impede the speaking of truth to patients in relation to their health care is totally unacceptable. Nor should it be acceptable for an organisation to give permission to health professionals of whatever seniority to withhold the truth from patients. So the withholding of truth from patients. And then there's many, many other things I could quote from, including the Madden Commission, going back to 2008, that set out the necessity for disclosure and mandatory disclosure and open disclosure, and it hasn't happened. I've 1 minute left. I would ask for clarity on the audit. I would ask for clarity on why, if we want to restore trust, that part of the bill has never been used. I'd like to know, in relation to the outsourcing of tests, what progress have we made? Because that was a fatal decision made by a PD-led government going back, and ye inherited that. But now you have the chance to change that. And when we outsource something as essential as testing for cervical smear test, we're in serious trouble as a civilized society. So what update has there been in relation to that? Are we on the road to ending the privatization of our lab services? And it's extraordinary that the restoration of trust part of the tribunal legislation has never been used. Isn't that extraordinary, that the restoration of trust on every level has never been restored. And so we have the women still fighting with the government, I should take back the word fighting, still struggling to get their voices heard to say this tribunal is not the most suitable mechanism. On reflection, in my opinion, the High Courts would be doing a much more efficient job if they were adequately resourced to hear the cases, and there is provision for private hearings, and that could have all been done. I won't go over my time.
Thank you very much,